Hello, I'm Daniel Benjamin, and I am the president of the American Academy in Berlin. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this fall's John P. Berkelen Lecture, Sarah Bernhardt's Knee, the Feminine Ideal in Belle, Époque, Rio de Janeiro. The lecture will be delivered by James N. Green, who is the John Berkelen Fellow this fall. The John Berkelen Fellowship in the Humanities was endowed in 2011 with the intention of fostering transatlantic dialogue in the humanities. Professor James N. Green is the Carlos Manuel de Cespedes Professor of Latin American History at Brown University, where he is currently director of both the Brazilian Initiative and Opening the Archives Project, and the executive director of the Brazilian Studies Association until June 30th of this year. Professor Green has traveled extensively throughout Latin America and lived for 8 years in Brazil, where he worked as an advisor for the Brazilian National Truth Commission, which investigated the state's violation of human rights during the military dictatorship that ran from 1964 to 1985. His books include Exile Within Exiles, Herbert Daniel, Gay Brazilian Revolutionary, also We Cannot Remain Silent, Opposition to the Brazilian Military Dictatorship in the United States, and Beyond Carnival, Male Homosexuality in 20th Century Brazil. He is also the editor of several different volumes. His work has been supported by the American Council of Learned Societies and the National Endowment of the Humanities, among others. In his Academy project, The Crossroads of Sin and the Collision of Cultures, Entertainment, Commerce, and Pleasure in Rio de Janeiro from 1860 to 1930, Professor Green is examining the multiple layers of interactions and sociability that took place in the Tiradentes Square in downtown Rio, Brazil's largest city in the late 19th and early 20th century. This public space, a district of bars, brothels, vaudeville revues, highbrow theaters, and later movie theaters, shaped popular and elite cultures, as well as influenced the forms of entertainment, business, and leisure activities. Professor Green traces the transformations that reconfigured broader Brazilian society and urban life at a time of transition from slavery to freedom, mass immigration from abroad, migration from the hinterland, and a revolution in gender norms. In this talk, Professor Green will, as I said, discuss Sarah Bernhardt's Knee, the Feminine Ideal in Belle, Époque, Rio. In it, he will use the very famous French actress Sarah Bernhardt's dramatic visit to Rio in 1905 to analyze the Brazilian elite's ideas concerning gender. He considers Bernhardt's reception on and off stage as a way of understanding the emergence of the new woman, as it's called, feminist ideal. And this concept profoundly influenced 20th century feminism, and it can further enhance present day gender norms discourses. Now, before I hand it over to Professor Green, let me just say that we will have a Q&A session after his talk, and you can start entering your questions just as soon as you want. Please, however, use the Q&A function on the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you have a raise your hand function, please don't use that. I can't see it. And I will get to as many of the questions as I can. And again, you don't need to wait until he's finished speaking to put in those questions. So with that, Professor Green, I turn it over to you. It's a pleasure to have you.
So first of all, I would like to thank Daniel Benjamin for this generous introduction, as well as John Thomas Eltringham for helping me organize this lecture, and the entire staff of the American Academy for their dedication in trying to make this semester successful in spite of all the challenges we faced. Though I was not able to be a resident fellow at the Academy this semester, I am delighted to be able to return to the Academy in the future, and I'm looking forward to my time in Wannsee and in Berlin. So we're going to talk today about Sarah Bernhardt. I personally call the first global star in her visits to Rio de Janeiro. Turn of the century, Rio de Janeiro was the bustling capital of a newly established Brazilian republic. Slavery had been abolished in 1888, the last stronghold of the institution in the Western Hemisphere. 14 months later, the military toppled the reign of Emperor Pedro II, who had ruled the country since 1840, when he assumed the throne at age 15. Tens of thousands of people of color streamed into Rio de Janeiro from the coffee plantations seeking work. Tens of thousands more Portuguese and Italian immigrants crossed the Atlantic to find new opportunities in the tropics. Always with their eyes cast on Europe, the new Republican political, economic, and social elites decided to transform the nation's capital into what they imagined would be the Paris of the tropics. The municipal government flattened downtown tenement buildings, forcing the poor inhabitants to move to makeshift housing on the steep granite hills surrounding the city, creating what we know today as favelas. They widened the streets to create broad boulevards inspired by Haussmann's transformations of Paris in the 1860s. They invited European performers to appear on the Rio stage. And among them was Sarah Bernhardt, arguably the first modern global celebrity. Much like modern-day pop stars, Bernhard carefully crafted her image as a larger-than-life figure who constantly found new ways to appear in the press and promote herself, whether it was with dramatic portraits, such as the one shown here, or her claims that she slept in a coffin, which is, I think, a classic example of self-promotion and getting journalist copy. To fuel her lavish lifestyle, she took advantage of the French theater's off-seasons to conduct international tours to North and South America, visiting Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, Montevideo, Buenos Aires, and Santiago de Chile in 1886, 1893, and 1905, where the Francophile elites showered her with adulation. As was previously mentioned, tonight's presentation is a tiny slice of a much larger book project, The Crossroads of Sin and the Collision of Cultures, Entertainment, Commerce, and Pleasure in Rio de Janeiro, 1860 to 1930, which examines the political, social, economic, and cultural transformations that took place in the nation's capital during a tumultuous period in Brazilian history. Tonight, we will focus on Sarah Bernhardt, the French diva actress who historian Mary Louise Roberts argues in Disruptive Acts represented the new woman, independent, modern, who manipulated notions of her femininity to her own advantage. We will examine the reaction to her presence in Rio among the white economic social elites that look toward Europe for their cultural references. We will also compare her to Círio Polonio, a Brazilian actress who adopted new gender performances inspired by European women as personified in Sarah Bernhardt, the grande dame of French theater. We will see how she then recreated a post-colonial parody of these performances and values as a criticism of the Brazilian elite's norms that greatly amused lower-class theatergoers. Decades before, the Brazilian modernists of the 1920s employed the metaphor of cannibalism to describe the ingestion and recreation of European culture within a Brazilian context, or before the notion of hybridity had become a postmodernist construct, this practice was already taking place on the Brazilian stage. While enslaved and working class women of color occupied public spaces in Brazil throughout the colonial period and during the empire in the 19th century, among white middle-class women, new opportunities and possibilities only opened up in the latter half of that century. By its end, the majority of primary school teachers were women. Middle and upper class women had broken into the legal and medical professions. Women produced a flurry of feminist journals and initiated campaigns for equal rights, including the right to vote. Some also took to the stage. The acting profession afforded a handful freedom and independence, usually for most elite or bourgeois women. They could frequent public space, move about freely, relatively freely, and enjoy a life unfettered from familiar restraints. The theater also offered some adventurous and free-spirited white women especially those from humble backgrounds, upward mobility, and access to men of other social classes. Yet because of an association between women of the stage and loose morals, they occupied a tenuous, liminal position in elite circles. On one hand, high society embraced those women that appeared in plays or operas representing high culture, European values, and sophistication. At the same time, female performers could suffer public scrutiny and bitter gossip for leading unconventional lives. Through negotiating this complicated status as pariah and as public performer, these women, I argue, pushed outward the possibility for others of their gender in a patriarchal and traditional society. So, in 1886, Sarah Bernhardt, France's preeminent dramatic artist, made her first of 3 South American tours. 3,000 people awaited her at Rio's docks. Politician and abolitionist Joaquim Nabuco exalted Mademoiselle Bernhardt on the front page of O País. Quote, "In Brazil, the great artist is still in the intellectual territory of her homeland. In no other country will she better verify with precision that verse that one often hears on stage. All men have 2 countries, their own and France." Having the divine Sarah perform in Rio was grounds for praises doubly declared. Quote, "At this moment, the first of all French theaters is not the house of Molière, but the São Pedro Theater," end quote. The visit of Bernhard to the imperial capital offered Rio's elites the opportunity to experience noble culture firsthand, noble French culture firsthand. On opening night, confusion reigned. Police struggled to maintain order as ticket scalpers offered exorbitant prices for available seats. The audience was composed of, quote, "the finest, most select and intelligent families and gentlemen of society," end quote, who joined members of the French colony and the imperial family. In attending a presentation of La Dame aux Camélias, one of Bernhardt's signature performances. Mademoiselle Bernhardt's Rio debut, however, did not go as smoothly as anticipated. Students occupying the inexpensive seats in the upper balconies began a ruckus when the actor portraying Armand Duval entered the scene. Commentators attributed their youthful rowdiness to the fact that the French actor was beardless and thus inappropriately representing the role of his manly, virile character. Added to the confusion, a lighted cigarette from the second gallery fell on the evening dress of the Baroness of Mangaguape, destroying most of her garment. Only due to the intervention of the famed playwright Arthur Azevedo, who stood up and demanded respect for the great French actress, and pleading from the impresario who offered to refund patrons' tickets, did the performance continue. By the evening's end, Bernhard had won over the audience entirely. Bernhardt's visit was marred, however, by another incident. Berthe Normont, another actress in the French company, was accused of having slapped Miss Bernhardt in an altercation outside the box office. The backstory is that she was leaving the company and allegedly was packing in her trunks things stolen from the company, and Bernhard accused her of that, and so she slapped Bernhard, and then she was taken to the police station. Bernhard, never one to shy away from publicity, ended up at the police station where Nabuco successfully defended her, and officers dropped all charges. And this is a version of the story that got all the way to the New South Wales newspaper and in New Zealand. At another gala performance in Bernhardt's honor, the audience's enthusiasm seemed limitless. Having exhausted the stock of flowers that they showered onto the stage, the male public began tossing items of clothing. Her send-off was no less tumultuous, as hundreds bid the last adieu. A professor of the military academy gave a farewell address and then presented Miss Bernhardt with a Brazilian flag that she dramatically draped over her shoulders, engendering further adoration from the crowd. Now, Sarah Bernhardt was not the first French actress to elicit such enthusiasm in Rio. In 1859, French entrepreneur Joseph Arnaud opened the Alcazar Lyrique, located near Rio's fashionable Rua do Ouvidor shopping district, lined with French-owned stores, restaurants, and cafes that targeted the sophisticated Francophile upper class. In 1864, Arnaud brought back from Paris a group of actresses, singers, and dancers to offer French entertainment to a Brazilian public. Among them was Aimee, who charmed the intellectual and political elite of the city, including the famous writer Machado de Assis, who wrote several columns about this amazing French actress. Many of these French performers, however, supplemented their income as prostitutes and as mistresses. Their embodiment of French culture increased their appeal over the Polacas, the Eastern European Jewish prostitutes in Rio de Janeiro, or Brazilian sex workers of mixed racial backgrounds. On stage, they exposed their ankles, knees, or thighs while singing such French hits as "Nothing is Sacred for a Soldier," in order to elicit the interest of potential clients, among them many members of the Brazilian elite. As the can-can became more popular entertainment for Brazilian audiences, dancers generously revealed their undergarments and normally hidden flesh to the excitement of the male audience. What distinguished a proper elite woman in Rio from the French cocotte was her public performance. And the cocotte is a word in French that means prostitute. According to the historian Jeffrey Nadell, for elite men of Rio, the cocotte's attraction derived not only from studied association with Parisian paradigms, but from the contrast they made with the perception of elite women. When proper women from Rio's elite did go out, Nadell observes, quote, there should be nothing of the coquette among them. The coquette's styles was well known, and one took great pains to avoid it and to maintain the silence, respect, and company tradition demanded. In the eyes of the Brazilian audience, Bernhardt was not a coquette. Although her personal life involved a series of rather public affairs, and she had an illegitimate son among many different lovers, in Brazil, her persona linked her to French refinement and sophistication. By embracing Bernhard as a serious dramatic actress, Rio's elites reaffirmed their social status as connoisseurs of European culture. Although Brazilian men showered her with flowers and their garments, they received no exposed knees or undergarments in return. Proper women could attend and applaud her performance because her role as the conveyor of the continental culture to a less civilized Brazil diminished any possible negative association with indecency, immorality, scandalous love affairs, and illegitimate children. Her performance on stage compensated for any moral transgressions committed off stage. Emperor Pedro II could receive and admire her. She could be the envy of elite society. 6 months before Bernhard set foot on the Brazilian stage for the first time, Revista Ilustrada published a 2-page article entitled "The Eternal Feminine" that heralded certain advances of middle-class and elite women. However, these changes merited certain caution. Citing expanding educational opportunities for Brazilian women, the article noted, quote, it's time to verify if these educational means should be broadened, if women should be given rights and establish equality with men in carrying out certain positions. Acknowledging that women were capable of entering many new professions and industries that had heretofore been occupied exclusively by men, society needed to hold the line at granting them political rights. Doctor or lawyer, perhaps, but voter or politician, never. The Belo sexo, as journalists so often named women in Brazil, might move into new occupations, but their beauty, elegance, and internal femininity need to remain in place. In analyzing the new women of turn-of-the-century France, historian Mary-Louise Roberts, mentioned previously, points to the strategy employed by certain women to define a personality apart from social convention, beyond their otherness to men, without getting trivialized or demonized by a set of stereotypes. French feminist journalist Marguerite Durand, the editor of the all-female staff daily newspaper La Fronde, for example, carved out new spaces for women by embracing and then subverting many of the notions attributed to La Belle Sexe. Flaunting her stunning beauty, blonde hair, and elegant style, she undercut masculine criticism and deflected anxieties about new realms into which women reporters had stepped: the courtroom, the parliament, and the political world. Using the age-old vision of women as actress, seductress, and, quote, real woman, to counter the stereotypical notion of feminist as shrill, ugly, masculinized man-haters, she caught her critics off guard and managed to fashion new possibilities for women by transforming seemingly traditional gender roles into something new. Likewise, Bernhard made use of an array of tropes assigned to women to create a public personality that afforded her freedom, independence, and immense popularity at home and abroad. According to Roberts, Bernhard's womanly woman would be immensely appealing to those men who, lost in the turmoil of fin de siècle gender relations, feared la grande séductrice to be an endangered species. Even her famous cross-dressing roles as Hamlet intervened in the tensions between the traditional woman and the new woman. As Roberts argues, in an era of debate about gender norms, Bernhard's star image presented a similar fantasy scenario that fulfilled a need on the part of her public for unity, resolution, and reassurance. To her more socially conservative fans, Bernhard appeased fears concerning the threat of the new woman and the demise of female seduction as an everyday pleasure. She transcended the perceived conflict between the independent new woman and the seductress. She was a living example of Marguerite Durand's contention that a woman need not lose her femininity to compete in a man's world. Now, soon after Bernhard's first triumphal Brazilian tour, Senhora Polônia, the daughter of Italian immigrants, made her dramatic debut on the Brazilian stage, imitating the divine Sarah in the musical review O Carioca. Carioca is a person from Rio de Janeiro, written by Arthur Azevedo, who had defended Bernhard in her premiere performance on the Brazilian stage. Following the conventions of the Revista do Ano, or the yearly review, in which actors parodied prominent figures and events of the previous year, Polônia played an unspecified celebrity who spoke Portuguese in a thick French accent. Senhora reenacted an exaggerated version of Bernhard's quarrel with her fellow actress, Berthe Montenoir, and made various references to the negative audience responses to the beardless amant during the opening night of La Dame aux Camélias. Of humble birth, Senhora Polônia's entrepreneurial parents successfully managed a fashion shop in downtown Rio that allowed them to send their only daughter to study in Europe. Returning to Rio, she began her entertainment career in opera, but was not very successful. After her 1886 imitation of Bernhard, Polônia became a popular actress, first in Rio and then in Portugal. Rather than trying to replicate Sarah Bernhardt, Senhora Polônia created a parody of mannerisms that were associated with European sophistication and poked fun at the French and Rio elites. Unlike Bernhard, however, Polônia did not restrict her repertoire to plays consecrated by the elites as high culture. The limited audience for sophisticated European fare and the growing urban market seeking popular entertainment drew her to lowbrow musical comedies. Her performance at age 51 as the elegant Française won rave reviews. Her playful French accent and her piquant double entendres thoroughly amused the lower and middle class audiences attending her performances. Her imitation of the sophisticated French woman, no doubt, also played with a certain disdain that the popular classes experienced toward the haughty airs of Rio's elites, who indiscriminately embraced all things French. Like many other new women of her time, she learned how to manipulate male images of the feminine to her advantage. She appropriated and incorporated the exaggerated, elegant, feminine French figure into her stage performances, while off stage, she refused to marry and became a successful independent theater entrepreneur. Like the Brazilian modernist 3 decades later, she borrowed and reshaped foreign cultural norms and created something uniquely Brazilian. Now, Bernhardt returned from her third and final series of performances in Rio in 1905. She was, however, not well. Her right knee bothered her, and she walked painfully with a cane. According to several biographers, in Rio de Janeiro, she suffered an accident that affected the rest of her life. As one biographer described it, on October 9th at Rio de Janeiro, she met with one of the great disasters of her life. She was playing in La Tosca, At the end of the last scene, Floria committed suicide by leaping off the parapet of the Castel San Angelo. Usually, of course, the stage behind the parapet was covered with mattresses. That night, for some unknown reason, the mattresses had been forgotten, and Sarah fell heavily on her right knee. She fainted with pain. Her leg swelled violently, and she was carried to her hotel on a stretcher. Next day, when she embarked for New York, a doctor was called to her stateroom, but his hands were so dirty that she refused to let him touch her. In vain, her friends protested and insisted that they would make him take a bath. Sarah would see no doctor until she reached New York 3 weeks later. The knee injury ultimately led to amputating her leg, forcing the divine Sarah to perform during her final years with a cork substitute, many times appearing on stage in a divan chair. And in fact, during the First World War, she was carried on a sedan chair to the front lines to give orations to mobilize and to make the troops feel patriotic. Now, when I began doing research for this paper, the incident of Bernhard's knee seemed a perfect way to end this presentation. I intended to argue that while the elite male audiences could enjoy the knees, thighs, and undergarments of French entertainers, the public performance of Bernhard or of any Brazilian actress who aspired to her theatrical heights required propriety and decorum on stage and a modicum of discretion off stage. Yet when reviewing Brazilian newspapers, I found no reference to the incident. To a certain extent, this made sense. Supposedly, the tragedy occurred in the last act of Bernhard's last performance on October 9th, 1905. But the dates didn't match. Sarah first arrived in Brazil on October 10th, 1905, a day after the alleged accident. Her last performance in Brazil was on October 17th in Shakespeare's Hamlet, where presumably her knees were indeed exposed to the audience, albeit covered by tights. In Europe, Bernhard had played the role of Floria in dramatic versions of Tosca, but there is no indication that she performed the piece during her tour. In fact, the same night as Bernhard's farewell rendering of Hamlet at the Lirico, Signora Jacobi and Mario Cavaradossi gave their last performance of Puccini's Tosca, the opera, at the Apollo Theater several blocks away. What does one make of all of this? Were her biographers wrong with details but right about the incident? Or was Bernhard engaged in myth-making, presenting herself as the tragic heroine of Tosca, who so thoroughly played her part that she injured herself permanently? Wasn't self-recreation in the public performances a series of expected persona an essential element in these actresses' lives as they constantly battle off stage for relative independence and freedom as adventurous and free-spirited women in a society still hostile to such behavior and inclined to immediately classify them as immoral? If Bernhard did in fact recreate herself as a tragic heroine, sacrificing herself or her leg for her art, wasn't this part and parcel of creating a larger than life figure that could withstand the social and moral aversions to a real life or offstage performance as a new woman? And wasn't Pologno's appropriation of the French language, style, and dress similarly a strategy for creating a space for herself in Rio society, as was her decision to parody elite's tastes? So one of the goals of my new book project, for which I have drawn the material for today's presentation, is to rethink how we can understand gender, representations of women, entertainment, and foreign influences on Brazilian culture as among the lenses upon which to analyze, or through which to analyze, the late 19th and early 20th century Rio de Janeiro in this important transition in Brazilian history. Thank you.
My colleague from Dartmouth College, we're not supposed to say the names of the questioners, but she got straight to the question that interests me, which Veronica Fuchner asks, wonderful talk. Did Bernhard's Jewishness register in Rio? And if yes, how?
It's very interesting. It does not register a bit in any of the representations of her, which is very strange because even though she had converted to from Judaism to Christianity and presented herself as a Christian, And especially after the Dreyfus case, she became very much mobilized in the pro-Dreyfus forces and talked about her Jewish origins. And if you look at any caricatures of Sarah Bernhardt that are drawn, they overly exaggerate her nose in a typical trope of the anti-Semitic trope of the Jewish noses. But it's not mentioned at all in any of the accounts of her visits to Rio. And I assume it's not also important in her visits to Argentina, although there's a much larger Jewish population in Argentina at the time.
Yeah, so that's fascinating. I'm just curious, where else did she travel when she was in?
So she did many tours, and she even did like the last tour several times to the United States. She traveled throughout the United States. She went to Canada, the United States, and then in Latin America, she traveled to Brazil, Rio, Sao Paulo, and Santos, the port city of Santos, coffee port city, and then on to Montevideo, and to Buenos Aires, and then to Santiago, and then to San Francisco, and then would take a transatlantic train cross to New York, performing in key places. Sometimes she performed in circus tents because there wasn't space, and she declaimed or did monologues in French of different personalities or figures that she acted out on the French stage. No translation. The same in Brazil. People just were listening to her vocal capabilities and her dramatic performance, and then applauding wildly as this great international performer.
So we have some more questions coming in. I'll get to them in a second. I just had to ask, I take it that it's simply a coincidence of anatomy that the title of your talk is similar to the name of a movie by the great French director Eric Romer. Claire.
Right, Claire's. Well, it was not necessarily a reference to that when I was devising this talk. I was really fascinated by the fact when I learned that she had gone to Brazil and that she had actually had this incident. There's a wonderful movie, in fact, that was made by a Brazilian female director about Sarah Bernhardt coming to Brazil on this last visit, which sets up the whole story of the fatal accident with the mattress, which is not placed on the floor for her not to fall on. And the whole idea behind that is some people are angry at Sarah Bernhardt for not having paid her for services rendered, and they pull the cushions that they had prevented for her from to break her fall, and she suffers this agonizing accident. What's really strange is that there's no indication, as I mentioned in the lecture, that she actually did damage her knee in Rio. If she did, she damaged it in a different way than her biographers claim to have done that. And I think another film that would be more appropriate would be Blame It on Rio, which is a way of kind of putting the blame on tropical informality and disorganization, which meant that someone didn't do what they were supposed to do, and as a result of that, the great French actress suffered and died. And when I was trying to figure this out, I got in contact with Mary Louise Roberts, who had written this wonderful book on Sarah Bernhardt and other people, and asked her if she knew anything about this incident. She said, well, I didn't really follow Sarah Bernhardt's trips abroad. I was really focusing on her performances in France and in Europe. But she said, if I had gotten $1 for every false lead based on what Sarah Bernhardt had written about herself, I would have been rich from that, because there were many ways she promoted herself. I mean, the picture in the coffin is one of many examples of arguing that she wanted to feel peaceful and quiet, so she would sleep in a coffin, which was just designed to get copied, to get the press to continue to follow her. So this, she did, her knee was injured when she was younger. It got worse. She did have it amputated and suffered very muchly from that and in her last years, but I don't know if we can really blame it on Rio.
Okay, another question for you. Thanks for this really interesting lecture. Were these developments with regard to perceptions of femininity in Brazil happening on roughly the same timeline as developments in Europe?
So Yes and no. There's always an attention by the elites of Latin America, the 1%, to be following the latest developments in Europe and receiving newspapers and following them and being influenced by feminist ideas. But as I try to suggest in this paper, there's always this process of cannibalizing it or anthropizing it, taking it and changing it to something different. So there is influence by European and North American feminists, especially in the early 20th century, when the most prominent feminist, Bertolt Lutz, gets very much involved in international feminist and suffragist activities and uses the international as leverage on convincing politicians to grant the right of suffrage in 1932 in Brazil. So there is an influence, but there's a lot of ways in which the feminists, not just in Brazil, but in other parts of Latin America, are trying to address the very specific reality of women and their role in Brazilian or in Latin American society. And although it's implicit in my talk, I didn't really go into depth today. I didn't want this to be too long of a talk. The tremendous racial divides, the fact that the women we're talking about are white women, when the overwhelming majority of the poor people and the servants are people of color, reflects kind of an elite feminist movement that will develop in the early 20th century, of educated women who will fight for suffrage with no consideration for poor women. And in fact, suffrage is restricted to only people who are literate, and therefore which will exclude the overwhelming majority of the population of Brazil when women get the right to vote in 1932.
I'm curious, did she, her tours in North America were quite famous. And in fact, I think in a number of American films, there are even references to her traveling through the West. Did she tour much in Europe?
She did. She toured every single moment she could get away from the stage because she needed money, because she had a very luxurious lifestyle. She went to Spain and Portugal. She went to England. I don't know if she went to Germany, but she definitely was in England, and they loved her.
Another question for you. Did Sarah Bernhardt call herself a new woman? Did she support the suffrage movement? And finally, what was her response? What was the response in Rio to her rival, Eleanor Duse?
Mm-hmm. So Eleanor Duse did not come to Brazil. Actually, I'm not sure that she did or did not. I'm going to retract that statement. Isadora Duncan was certainly later in Brazil and a very important personality that came through in the early 20th century as a modern dancer. This is one of the contradictions in this presentation. She did not use the language of new woman. And I see this analogy as similar to my niece, who refuses to call herself a feminist, but believe that women are superior to men and that women have been really screwed over in life. But she doesn't like the term because it's associated with a series of stereotypes about feminism. And I think the new woman, even though people like Marie Durand tried to fashion it in a positive way, was also associated with the image of the blue stocking and the woman battle axe, the woman who was masculinized and defeminized. And so my sense is that I don't find references to embracing this term for herself as a new woman, although I argue that she is acting as if she were in the spirit of the new women who are really forging new, conquering new territories and spaces. And that she was not very political except for her engagement with the Dreyfus affair and being very nationalistic and patriotic. So I'm not at all, I have no indications she was involved actively in the suffrage movement and defending the right of women to vote. And as Eleanor Duse, I can't comment on that. I don't have enough information to give an intelligent conversation answer to that.
So I'm not sure this chronology is right, but the question is posed, did she and Carmen Miranda coincide in Brazil, or did they know of one another?
So no, they didn't know of each other. Carmen Miranda came to Brazil in the early 20th century as the daughter of a Portuguese immigrant and lived in Rio, but she only became famous in the 1930s. And by that time, Sarah Bernhardt died in 1923, and so she was no longer there. Carmen Miranda became a very important samba singer in Rio and was discovered by Schubert and brought to New York in 1939 because the World's Fair in New York had caused a drain on audience attendance on Broadway, and she was in a show called The Lights of Paris, and she performed a 7-minute skit, and she just was a total overnight sensation, and that launched her career. She went back to Brazil and then came back to the United States, start doing films, and become the personality that kind of stereotypically represents Brazil during World War II and becomes the ambassador of Latin America. But they would not have, they did not they overlapped it chronologically in the sense that Carmen Miranda was alive and in Rio, but that was after Sarah Bernhardt had left the last time in 1905.
Okay, another viewer writes, fascinating lecture, thank you. You mentioned that Polonia's appropriation and parody of French culture predated Andrade, am I pronouncing that right? Andrade's theory of anthropophagy by about 2 decades. Might Andrade have watched Polonia and others like her and incorporated their cultural strategies into his later thoughts on cannibalism?
Right. So this is Mário de Andrade and Osvaldo Andrade, who was the person who writes the Cannibalistic Manifesto in 1928, which is basically arguing that Latin American culture absorbs European culture and digests it and creates something new. I think, as in many cultural phenomena in Latin America, there are many origins of new ideas and thoughts. And so I would argue that this kind of cannibalism is taking place in the early 20th century, as are new notions of race and racial mixing that become popularized by a famous Brazilian sociologist named Gilberto Freire in 1933, when he writes a very important book called Masters and Slaves, Casa Grande de Senzalas. But that in fact, these kinds of ideas are already on the ground in practice in Brazil, and to a certain extent, these intellectuals are articulating them. They're expressing them. I don't have any knowledge that, in fact, Osvaldo de Andrade was in São Paulo, saw Cicinidas Polonio in the stage in Rio. That might have happened. But I think these ideas are circulating in different ways, and intellectuals then grab them and make them popularized through manifestos and articulations and writing about them. This mixture is happening. This appropriation is happening. It's happening throughout the colonial period as well, as people in what becomes Brazil are appropriating Portuguese customs and traditions and transforming them significantly. So yes, it's happening, although I don't know that Osvaldo de Andrade, in fact, was inspired by those performances to develop his theories.
Okay, another appreciative viewer writes, I was wondering if Bernhard's hyphenated third space situation between Judaism and Christianity and La Grande Nation and a rapidly transforming Brazil strengthened her resolve to build a career in South America, a career exporting, if you will, European culture, so to speak, but supported by Brazilian hunger for the latter.
I think her consideration for her career in South America was much more driven by the financial restraints on her large, her expenses. She had a tremendously expensive lifestyle that she lived in Paris. And so I think this was very much a calculated, shrewd business person figuring out this is a good way to make money when the theater is down in Paris. Instead of going to the countryside, I'm going to go to South America. And she understood that the elites of Latin America, who were becoming extremely wealthy through export economy, commodity production, are hungry for what they consider as the cultural world of Europe, and so they're very willing to pay exorbitant prices to see the great stars. So all of the important opera stars and many of the important theater people and other personalities will come through the capitals of South America, of Mexico also, and sometimes in capitals of Central America, to take advantage of the difference in the global north and the global south in terms of seasons, and increased rapidity in steamboat mobility, to take advantage of a market that had not heretofore been very easily available to them. So this is a phenomenon that's happening significantly. Sarah Bernhardt is one of many people who are following these tours and being a success. And so many of the theaters book both the international stars coming through in certain times of the year and then national productions during the rest of the year.
Fascinating. Um, One viewer asks, would love a few glimpses into the sort of actual parody that cropped up in the popular theater scene. Vaudeville, did any of that gentle or not so gentle mocking of French culture make its way back to the upper class Rio theater scene?
So upper class theater would be either very finely attuned plays written by Brazilian playwrights or translations of European production. All the classics of French and British drama would be translated and then produced on the Brazilian stage. Sometimes by troops of people from Portugal, trained in theater in Portugal, would come to Brazil and perform European classics in Portuguese in Brazil. And the same would be in the circuit of people from Spain to Spanish-speaking Latin America. The emergence of low-class or lower-class popular theater, a kind of vaudeville production that is humorous and slapstick, which becomes very popular in the 1870s and 80s and will continue to be more popular in this period, is one in which, for example, Polonia would have imitated, as I suggest, she imitated Sarah Bernhardt with not only her French accent, but with a lot of sexual innuendos. She is portraying herself as, so I didn't mention this in my talk, but there was a hierarchy of prostitution in Brazil, and the most expensive prostitutes were women who either were French, and there were some French women who came to Rio to work or to Brazil to work as prostitutes, but mostly it was women who pretended they were French. They would adopt French names. Some of these women were Jewish prostitutes coming from Eastern Europe who traveled through France and adopted the persona of French women and sold themselves as French women in Brazil. The highest paid women were francesas, and then the polacas, which was the term for basically Jewish prostitutes in Rio. Because they were white skinned, they had a greater value. And then women of mixed racial backgrounds, and then women of African descent, of dark skin, were the lowest paid prostitutes. And so there was an association between sexual desire and whiteness and European culture. And so Bologna in her performances is also presenting the idea of herself as potentially not necessarily Sarah Bernhardt, who is a high class, wonderful, cultured person, represents the best of European culture, but possibly a fake Francesa prostitute who is actually not as pure as is presented in elite theater when she is acclaimed by the elites, including the emperor and the emperor's family. And so in the lower ranks of theater, popular theater, this critique is played out a lot in slapstick comedy and humor, which is typical of vaudeville in the United States at the same time. It's a similar genre. It's really borrowed from Iberian theater, but there's a kind of a similarity of this kind of production in the late 19th and early 20th century, which would make it familiar to international audiences. And so she's making references to, she's pretending to be upper class, but she's exaggerating their talk, their air, their clothes, their ways, and making fun of them in the way that she reaches the lower classes and receives tremendous popularity for her audience. She was also a very interesting entrepreneur because she decided that she would actually pack in 3 performances a night in her theaters in order to take advantage of the space and get more ticket sales. So she could lower prices and get more people to come into the theaters by increasing the audience by doing 3 performances, which is of course very exhausting on the theater production, but was very successful for her financially.
I'm curious, are there any recordings of Bernhardt's later appearances in Rio?
In Rio, no. She did one movie late in her career, which I've not seen, but I've read a lot about. And I had not even found a recording. In fact, I haven't found a single image of her in Brazil. A lot of the images I showed were kind of borrowed and were suggestive as opposed to actual images. of hers. They don't seem to have been recorded in some way that I can find.
Hmm. Another question. How would you compare the careers of Sarah Bernhardt and Anna Held?
So I'm not able to do that because I'm not familiar with Anna Held as a actress. I apologize for my ignorance. I'm not a historian of the theater. I'm an historian of Brazilian culture, and this became kind of a side interest of mine because I discovered her and was very interested in understanding how Brazilians did understand international personalities. And the idea that I found that she had not really hurt her knee in Rio was kind of a hook also for this story. But so I don't really know. I think I can answer that question, unfortunately.
Okay, well, I can't either, so we'll move right along. Would Bernhard have been accepted in a polite private society in Rio?
Not only was she accepted, but she had
That,
personal audiences with the king, with the
yeah.
emperor, and was extremely well. She was seen. The scandalous part of her life, which was well known in Europe, is erased in all of the representations of her in the press and in the way people write about her. She is seen as a great personification of European culture, and not as a woman that has a scandalous background, who has different affairs and has a son from a liaison. And so all of that is erased, and she becomes a representation of Europe and at its height, and the kind of idealized woman of Europe at the time. Which is, I think, what is interesting about the way she presents herself and is understood in Latin America.
Was there any relationship, or was there any involvement of Bernhard with the famous opera theaters in the Amazon, Manaus and Belém?
Right. So as people might know, there was a huge rubber boom in Brazil in the 1860s, but the 1870s it really picks up until 1912, when rubber is produced in Ceylon and Southeast Asia, and therefore the bottom of the market drops out of the rubber industry. And so in the late 1890s, or no, it's early 20th century, a huge, beautiful opera house is built in Manaus, which is at the center of the Amazon and the upper Amazon River. And the elites, the rubber barons, will attend operas by European performers wearing heavy velvet clothes and silks, which are the fashion in Europe at the time. It's a moment of tremendous wealth and tremendous exploitation of the rubber workers, the rubber tappers in this period. She did not go to Manaus. It's a very tedious trip, and it generally was for people who crossed Europe to the Amazon and went back. The currents of the Atlantic, the South Atlantic, make it very easy to go from Portugal to the port city of Belém do Pará and then up the Amazon much more easily than going south. And so there's kind of two routes. There's one that's the northern Atlantic, the northern part of the southern Atlantic route from Europe to the Amazon, and then another typical route which takes people to Rio, to Sao Paulo, and then south to Montevideo in Argentina. So she did not go there and was not part of that circuit. Some of the opera singers went to Manaus and then took later trips down, but it's a very complicated and long trip to do, and wasn't that normal.
Right. Okay, I think we have our last question, unless something comes in. Bernhard was highly criticized in Europe for using a kind of old style acting, and that criticism was voiced by, among others, George Bernard Shaw. She never performed Ibsen, for example, which was kind of a touchstone of modernism. Did this criticism appear at all in Rio, or were they just totally bought into the old style?
They were enamored of the old style, and they thought it was fabulous. She was praised for her tremendous ability to declaim, her dramatic gestures. I think this also worked, although the elites all learned French as their second language, and so most of the people attending the performances would have mostly understood her French, not entirely, but to a certain extent they would have had an understanding of the French. I think a lot of what they were interested in was the performance of a woman who was larger than life, gesturing and moving in dramatic fashion on the stage. And this just they loved it. And they thought it was just what the epitome of fine art and fine theater were. Even though I refer to Bernhard as a new woman in the sense that I think she's breaking the same ground that new women are breaking at the same time in Europe, she is a part of a traditional society and a part of the elite, which is wed to all the privileges that famous actresses had in France and in Latin America because of their connections to high culture in Europe. So she's a complicated figure like many, and the analogy I gave earlier to my niece, and I've had debates with her about why she's totally a feminist, and she just refuses to use this term because it has a bad association with it. I think the ideas of the early 20th century suffragists and the new women who are breaking grounds, sometimes it was very articulated and conscious, and other times it was de facto a phenomenon that wasn't articulated as such, but had that effect. And I think that's what, to a certain extent, is happening with people like Bernhard and others. Or Bologna, they're breaking new grounds. They're doing new things that women had not done before. In the case of Bernhard, she is playing with her femininity as a way of allowing herself to be in spaces and places which would heretofore not be acceptable, at least according to Mary Louise Roberts' reading of Bernhard, which is convincing to me. And so she is being cutting edge in a lot of ways, but she's traditional in a lot of ways. And I think we can see this if we analyze late 20th century, early 21st century feminism, where you'll have, I'll use the analogy of certain conservative Republican women who in some ways are maintaining tremendously old-fashioned ideas of the roles of women, but in other ways are occupying space and carrying out functions that women heretofore had never done, and so are really opening doors and possibilities that had not existed before. I mean, Sarah Palin, as a vice presidential candidate, although we could say that she was extremely conservative in many ways, was and reproducing a lot of traditional ideas of gender, was in fact performing in ways that many women had not performed heretofore. So I think that's a kind of one way to understand this phenomena in the early 20th century and as it maybe plays out in the early 21st century.
So another question for me, is there have there been similar analyses of Bernhardt's visits in the US and particularly in the West? I mean, I think the sort of popular image is that her visits were a great opportunity for sort of provincial elites to demonstrate their cultural bona fides. But I'm curious if there was anything, any dimension of it that related to gender roles.
So there have been articles written about her visits to, there are articles about her visits to most parts of the world. So you'll find that there, and it is exactly as you say, argued in most of these articles that she is legitimizing the local elites' connections to high culture and to European culture. Much less gendered analysis, and that's one of the things I think I bring to this conversation. And my interest is not just Bernhard per se, but the way her visit has an impact or how it's understood in Latin America, in Brazil. But this, the study of Bernhard as a global personality has been put out there by scholars over the last 15, 20 years.
I'm curious, do you have any people today who you think of as playing similar roles to what Sarah
when I
Bernhardt?
was, yeah, so it's come, I mean, to a certain extent, someone in the Academy encouraged me to kind of think about my presentation in terms of the connections to today. And so that was kind of a late addition to my talk and thinking about that. I would say that someone like Madonna, I mean, that could give many examples, but I'll give the example of Madonna. In a lot of ways, for the period in which she became famous and a global star, was just like Bernhard, incredibly conscious of self-promotion and how to play her career and become known. playing the press and playing her personal life and everything to become well known and loved, not just for her talents as a singer, but also for the person as a whole, the package that was Madonna. And she was very good at curating that. And I think before Hollywood, Sarah Bernhardt was doing that very consciously in Europe, as were other actresses like Eleanor Duse and others. But I think Bernhard is the best example of how one fashioned that kind of role. And I think Madonna does that. And Madonna, again, in a lot of ways, is breaking new roles for women as singers, women as performers, and women as sexual beings who can talk openly about AIDS and talk about homosexuality and all kinds of alternative ways of thinking about love and sex. And I think in that way was pushing in popular culture a lot of the barriers that had been restricting society before she really became the international phenomenon that she is today.
Yeah. No, Madonna came to my mind as well. And also that line in, I can't remember the name of it, the early documentary about Madonna, in which I believe Warren
Truth or Dare.
Beatty, I'm
Truth or
sorry?
Dare. Truth or Dare.
Where Warren Beatty says, "Does it? If it isn't on camera, does it not happen?" Something.
Exactly. He's sitting in the dressing room, cowering, being very upstaged by Madonna, and she is very good at playing the role of the media. And I love the picture of Sarah Bernhardt in the coffin, which, I mean, you look at this, are you crazy? Would anyone sleep in a coffin? But I mean, she got the reporters to play that role, I mean, to buy into that and report seriously that she really did sleep in a coffin. And that was one of the things that she enjoyed doing. And that was just a wonderful shock publicity stunt. So she is really figuring out in the 19th century how to use the media as a publicity stunt, like other people are doing. She's not the only person, but I think as a global star, she's the most effective. And because she's on this international circuit to promote herself, to get extra money, to be seen by the world, because France is seen as the epitome of culture, global culture at the time, she's able to capitalize that on more successfully than many other personalities that are trying to do something similar in the same time period.
Another question: How does an audience that's scandalized by an unbearded male actor respond to Sarah Bernhardt's cross-dressing as Hamlet?
So I can't tell you what the people who were the students who were upset and were causing a ruckus on their opening night in 1886 were thinking when they saw Hamlet. I have no way of knowing what they were thinking, but I could argue that I think women playing the role of Hamlet is not threatening to gender roles because it's women who are seen as inferior playing someone superior. And it was considered, I think, daring and interesting and fascinating. If it had been a man playing the role of a woman, it would have to be a parody or a perfect replication of femininity to work in some way. But I think this is part of the glamour around Bernhardt, that she's doing these amazingly bold performances by even playing the role of Hamlet and doing it successfully. So the reviews of her performances of Hamlet are universally positive, that she did a fabulous job, that she is an amazing Hamlet, and she is very emotionally convincing to the audience. It didn't seem to upset them. In fact, perhaps for the young men who were upset by Durand, there might have been something enticingly exciting about her cross-dressing in some way that might have elicited some desire or some fascination in them. But I don't know that because we don't have any voices from those people. We just have this incident which indicates certain kind of upsetness about the opening performance. And this is the version of journalists trying to explain why there was such poor performance among the sons of the elite who are students in Rio on, amounts of money their fathers have given them to live in Rio, to study in Rio, and are just being, difficult young elite boys being rowdy in a performance, or exaggerating their passion, their feelings, their attitudes. That's how I can read that incident and how I think it took place.
So there is a long tradition in the English theater of cross-dressing, though, of boys and men, not in the Portuguese theater.
there is in the colonial period when women were not on the stage, and so men were playing the roles of women.
I see.
But that changes in the mid-19th century, and then the cross-dressing only becomes characters that are parodied or laughed at as a or mistaken identity of a man dressing as a woman to conceal his identity for a period of time. But not
So,
like the long tradition. I mean, the other thing about theater in Brazil is that it really is only introduced successfully. There's a little bit of theater in the colonial period, but it's only really introduced strongly when the imperial court of Portugal is escaping Napoleonic troops have invaded Spain, and then Portugal in 1808, and the royal family flees to Rio de Janeiro in order not to be arrested and to detained by Napoleonic troops, and then come to this backwater and say, wow, this is pretty bad. There's not much theater here. And so they bring theater, and they become patrons of the theater and import European theater productions and encourage companies to come. And the emperor needs to have a cultural life, and so theater revolves around the life of the court to a certain extent.
So I think this is our, well, maybe we have more than one question, but here is one. Would you put Josephine Baker somehow in between Sarah Bernhardt and Madonna?
No, I think it's a wonderful idea about, I mean, Josephine Baker is such a complex person because in so many ways she's going to reproduce stereotypes of African women, African American women in her performances. The famous ones of the banana scenes, the banana kind of skirt she's wearing are pretty bad in that regard. But she's also playing with, I think she's like Polonio, playing with a situation where she's a Black woman in Paris, trying to carve out a space for herself there. She becomes an exotic figure, a very popular figure, and captures the imagination of the French as kind of the exotic other to a certain extent, and pushing boundaries. And I must commend her because she was a very loyal fighter in the resistance during World War II, and refused to perform with Maurice Chevalier, who was a collaborator as a result of that, and then had a fixation on adopting kids, and I think adopted like 1,000 kids later in her life.
That's a fascinating figure. So you've talked about Sarah Bernhardt's impact on gender roles in Rio, and one viewer asks, is there something going in the other direction, transatlantically, towards Paris, for example, a Brazilian actress who may have had an impact in France? And she cites the phenomenon of tango in Paris and the impact that it had on gender at the turn of the 20th century.
So that would have been an Argentinian exportation to export to Europe as opposed to a Brazilian one. Yeah. Samba is brought over, and musical forms are a little before samba called machixe, and become very popular. They're mostly Afro-Brazilian men who are performing the music. It becomes very popular as this dance form for a period of time, which is similar to samba called machixe, is also performed in Europe as a craze, not as important a craze as tango, as a craze that is exported back. I don't know of a famous Brazilian performer who goes to Europe, a woman performer who goes to Europe from Brazil and has that same impact that I can think of. I'm not aware of one. So it's more men performing music, and their Afro-Brazilian music that is being exported to Europe.
Okay, well, I think we ought to draw things to a close. This has been an absolutely fascinating talk, and I really want to thank Jim Green for this. And in particular, I want to say we look forward to continuing the conversation when you get to Berlin, and we very much look forward to your getting to the Academy again. This has been a really tough semester for everyone, but I'm hugely grateful to those fellows who had to stay in the U.S. and have done such a great job contributing to the life of the Academy through their online presentation. So I really do appreciate that.
And I want to thank you again, and also say to the Academy as a whole, I think that you managed an incredibly difficult and horribly awkward situation with grace and elegance, and I was very appreciating because I could empathize with the decisions and the dilemmas you were facing as you were trying to make this semester work. So thank you very much for the invitation, and I look forward to being there in person.
Well, great. let me just say to everyone who is still with us that our upcoming events on December 3rd, that is 2 nights from tonight, the Academy will host the 11th session, the 8th session of our series, The Road to the Election. Road to Election Night and Beyond. And this has been organized by a whole slew of like-minded transatlantic institutions, political foundations here in Germany. Thursday night's discussion is entitled Migration, Flight, and U.S. Immigration Policy under President Biden. Obviously a hot topic when you consider how much of the news of the last 4 years has centered around conflicts over immigration, migrants, and the like. And in this panel discussion, we will host Alexander Olenikov of the New School, Eric Schwartz, President of Refugees International, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration, and Roberto Suro, Professor of Journalism and Public Policy at the University of Southern California. And they will discuss what post-Trump policy might look like and what the challenges that the new administration will face will be. If you would like to attend this or any other of our events, please go to our website, www.americanacademy.de, and register under upcoming events. And with that, I will say good night. Please all stay healthy, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks so much for coming.